Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We are dealing with chapter 27 of Matthew's Gospel, and we are at the point where Jesus has been crowned with thorns and he has been mocked in his kingship. And before we go on, we just have to keep remembering who he is, that the person who is going to Calvary is not only the King of the Jews, he's the King of Israel. He's the King of all the chosen people. And this is what St. Paul says about him later. It is even more certain that through this one man, Jesus Christ, he will cause everyone to reign in life, who receives the free gift that he does not deserve of being made righteous through him. So the reason why Jesus has allowed this awful mockery and this crowning is to enable you and me to reign in life. And the book of Revelation chapter 5 verse 10 says, "Lord, you made them a line of kings and priests to serve our God and to rule the world." He paid a terrible price to hand the world over to his disciples and say to his disciples, would you rule without the sword? Would you rule as I did, with love and humility, with forgiveness? And would your love conquer the world? And so the extraordinary thing is that even when, he has been brutalized and looks no longer human, and he has been crowned in this absolutely ferocious way, at the same time, there's an extraordinary majesty in his person and in his features. So much so that at the very beginning, when Jesus was mocked by the chief priests, they actually blindfolded him. They couldn't stand the beauty and the glory of his eyes. And the mystics tell us the same thing about the Roman soldiers. They actually could not look at his eyes, so they blindfolded him. And the only way they could continue their mockery was to blindfold him. They were looking at the glory of God in a man fully alive, no matter what they had done with him. But the Roman soldiers belonged to a world where the sword was dominant, where might was right. And Jesus had to show them that that was absolutely not God's way of doing things. But even though they mocked him, scourged him, crowned him, he was still the King of the Jews. He was still the Son of God. They couldn't undo that because this was reality. This is who he actually was. And so when you go into the book of Revelation, in chapter 5 and verse 5, you'll hear him proclaimed in heaven that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. And so the scroll of the history of the human race is actually handed to him. It's just necessary for us to remember that before we go on, because otherwise the sheer brutality of what is going on could blind your eyes. Okay, so we move on to the next terrifying phase of this drama of the Passion of Jesus. So I want to pick up in Matthew 27 from verse 32. On their way out to Golgotha. Now Matthew is telling you very, very little. He leaves an enormous amount of detail out, which Luke and the others put in. They came across a man from Cyrene, Simon by name, and they enlisted him to carry the cross. And that's all you're told about Simon. But we have to say a little bit more than that. We know that a lot happened on the road to Calvary, but Matthew wants to get it all over with because he couldn't deal with it then. And it seems that even trying to put it on paper, he still couldn't deal with the horrendous things that had been done to Jesus, his Lord and Savior. And so what we have is, as soon as the soldiers are ready, then Jesus is simply shunted off to be killed. Now, Luke will give you another scene before that, and that is the presentation of Jesus before the people and Pilate's acclamation, "Behold the man," or "What a man," which is quite amazing. Matthew doesn't do that. Matthew doesn't even stop to tell you that Jesus picked up the cross. He just gets on with the journey. And he wants you to remember that the scapegoat is shunted off to the altar in order to be killed. Golgotha was called the place of the skull, and it's the traditional burial site of Adam. So I want to put a thought into your head, if you haven't thought of it already, maybe you have. way ahead of me, and that is, where was the Garden of Eden if Adam was buried in Jerusalem? Where was it? But it was called the place of the skull. That means it represents empty-headedness, because a skull has no substance in it. And it represents the empty-headedness of the human race when it does its own will against God's will, when it pits its own puny nothingness against the might and power of God, and when it operates without wisdom and without understanding and without the gifts and fruits of the Spirit. So the place where they actually killed Jesus is actually very important, because here the pride of Adam that revolted against God meets the humility of Christ that brings the human race back to God. Here the disobedience of Adam meets the obedience of Christ. Here death and life fought and life won. And here human power pitted itself against God's power and God won. And so just as Jesus made reparation for all the empty-headedness of the foolish leadership that has gone on in the world since the fall of Adam, so here in the place of the skull, he replaces this empty-headedness with wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and the fear of the Lord. All the signs that God is around. And so Jesus restores everything to us. But on the day when this happened, nobody was able to see that. Nobody was able to understand. What makes me sad is not that the people then didn't understand, but far too many now don't understand. And so on Calvary, Jesus experiences absolute, abject rejection from the chosen people. God had done so much for them. And the final incredible thing he had done was that he became incarnate to live among them, that he would actually call himself by their name and by their culture and by their religion. No other country or culture on earth has ever had a privilege remotely like that. And so it seems almost unbelievable that they would reject him. But there's something I have to tell you. And I keep on telling you that you have to go back into the Old Testament to get the answers. I hope at least you get that out of my messages, that the answers are there. Catholics are inclined to neglect the Old Testament. That's old times. And they don't realize that when Jesus taught in the synagogues and he taught from the scriptures, he was teaching from the Old Testament. And if Jesus taught from the Old Testament, I think you and I should do the same. Okay, so let's go back there looking for some kind of enlightenment. And if you go back to Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32, you'll find Jacob, the father of Israel, struggling with an angel all night. Now, Jacob is running away from home because he has stolen the birthright from his brother. And so he has to go to another land, and then he has to try and settle down and have a family and so on. On the journey, Jacob has to sleep out in the open. And he is met by an angel who doesn't identify himself. But as Jacob struggled with the angel all night, Jacob realized he was struggling against God. And when morning came round, the angel said, "What is your name?" And the man said, "Jacob." Jacob said, "What's your name?" And the angel wouldn't give that one, because the angel represented the Lord. Okay. And to stop Jacob from actually trying to overcome him, the angel struck him in the socket of the hip. And from then on, Jacob actually limped. And the angel said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, it will be Israel." Literally, that means Prince of God. But the angel said, "The reason why we're giving you this name is because you've been strong against God." Now, one of the terrifying mysteries that we don't really see when we're reading the gospel and very particularly when we're in the Passion of Christ, is that Israel is being very strong against God, and that Israel has the bravery to stand up against God and to stand up against God's will and to impose her own will and say, absolutely no, what you want, we don't want, we want what we want. And they struggle right up to the death of Christ, strong against God. But in the end, she lost the battle. She lost the fight. It was the angel who actually overcame Jacob, not the other way around. And that battle between Jacob and the angel actually colored the whole history of Israel and all their battle against God's will and all the rest of it. So this time, Israel loses big time. She not only loses the battle with God, but she also loses the battle with the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire is sick of all the rebellions that are going on with the Jewish people, and they eventually come in and crush them completely. And in the end, they expel them all from the land. So Israel has fought too long. There's a point at which the game is over. You should admit defeat, but they wouldn't admit defeat at all. And just as at this point when the struggle between Israel and the Lord is reaching its peak, help comes to Jesus from a very unusual source. Now, the only person who pleaded for his life was a Gentile woman, and now it's a foreigner from Africa who is brought in on the scene. Now, this Simon from Cyrene is North Africa, and there was a huge colony of Jews living in those countries in North Africa at the time, and he was coming to Jerusalem to worship God. And he accidentally found Jesus. He was not looking for Jesus. All he wanted to do was fulfill his duty in the Passover. But the Roman soldiers despised people from Africa. The African people have been abused by other nations for millennia. And it wasn't just in Christian times that they were reduced to slavery. They were reduced to slavery in the Roman times and also in the times of Egypt and so on. Those poor people have been treated very badly. And so because he's African, he is forced to carry the cross for Jesus. Now, Matthew doesn't tell you why. You have to go into the other Gospels to know why Jesus is struggling so much, because Matthew's not going to tell you he fell 3 times and all the other things that happen. He's not going to tell you that. So we get interested in what Matthew actually picks up, because if he picks up something, he has a reason for it. When you go to, I think I wrote it down, Mark 15:21, Mark tells you that this Simon of Cyrene had 2 sons called Alexander and Rufus. And when you go to the Acts of the Apostles and St. Paul's letter to the Romans, you'll find Alexander and Rufus actually named as leaders of the early church. Now, that's the clue that you need as to why Matthew picks up Simon of Cyrene instead of saying, well, this kind of thing happens, you know. He doesn't say that. He's saying this is significant, because we know from the early church tradition and from the saints who have spoken to us that Simon was very reluctant to carry the cross of Jesus initially, because he was on his way to worship God and he didn't know who Jesus was. But the early church tradition tells us that when Simon looked into the eyes of Jesus, everything changed. Everything. They even tell us that he no longer felt the weight of the cross. I wouldn't imagine that is physically so, but that something had happened to him interiorly. The Lord he was looking for, he found. And he found him on the way of the cross. And the first introduction of Africa to Jesus was the carrying of the cross. And this is the introduction of that whole suffering continent into the kingdom of God. It's very special. It was a very special, transforming day for Africa, very special. And so he was changed, his whole family was changed, and his sons became leaders of the early church. That tells you what the eyes of Jesus did to anybody, and why the people who mocked him needed to blindfold him in order to be able to persevere. They couldn't tolerate the love and the humility and the glory and the divinity that was shining out at them through those wonderful eyes. So Matthew, in his very brief description, tells us that when they reached the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull that we've already talked about, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. Now, Matthew gives you the actual word that's translated gall. It's koles, and it can be translated either poison or gall. Poison is probably the better word, but the translators didn't want to give you that. In other words, that they would give him a drink that would shorten his life. It would certainly dampen down some of the pain, but shorten his life, and Jesus wouldn't take that. Jesus was going to pay every single penny. That he loved the people who hated him. He loved the people who rejected him. And he was prepared to do anything to get that Sanhedrin into heaven. It's incredible. When he said, love your enemies, he actually meant it. But sometimes when we read that, we're not taking it seriously. And so this meeting of Simon of Cyrene, he disappears as soon as you arrive at Calvary, because after that his function is over. But if he was changed drastically by Jesus just looking at him, he would have stayed, and he would have seen this extraordinary mystery of love conquering hate. Okay, so he refused the drink. That's because he doesn't want the sacrifice in any way altered, or he doesn't want anybody taking away from him what he can actually do for others. Love must conquer altogether. So when they had finished crucifying him, notice Matthew does not want the details. He does not want the stripping of Jesus again, the nailing of Jesus, the hanging of Jesus. He doesn't want any of that. Matthew can't cope with it. So when they had finished crucifying him, they shared out his clothing and cast lots. The normal custom at the time was that there would be 4 soldiers in charge of a crucifixion or some kind of an execution, and the person who was being executed had no right to anything. And so while the person was still alive, they would actually share out his clothes among the soldiers. So one of those 4 got the blood-stained priestly garment of Jesus. Unfortunately, nobody knows what happened to it. Unfortunately. Because that was one of the most precious treasures that the early church would have held on to. And they sat there and just waited for him to die. So it seems as if it's all done, it's all over. Not at all. Absolutely not at all. One of the great insights into what's going on is that, again, you've got to go back to the scriptures. It's all there. And if you read Psalm 22, it might be Psalm 21, depending on the translation that you have King David writing a psalm in his own day, which is such a perfect description of what Jesus experienced interiorly that you have to ask, where did he get this information from? Because in David's time, the 10th century before Christ, crucifixion was absolutely unknown. And yet he describes perfectly what Jesus was experiencing interiorly. So while Matthew doesn't want you to look at what is going on the outside, it's actually necessary to look at what's going on the inside. And Matthew is actually going to quote this psalm in a little while. So I want to do at least a little bit of the psalm so you get a sense of what Matthew was thinking of when he's putting this text together. And it begins with, my God, why have you deserted me? And this is somebody in total agony. And if you're in total agony, it's the one time you need God very close. There's 2 ways in which we address God. That is God out there in a distance on his own planet, far away from me. And the other one is Lord, which is close. And the person who is in pain feels that God is very far away. And he says, how far from saving me are the words I groan. I call all day, my God, and you never hear. I call all night and you never listen. And yet, Holy One, this is the prayer of Jesus. Father, your name is holy. He said, you make your home in the praises of Israel. You're always present when your people pray. And he said, our fathers put their trust in you, you delivered them. They called on you, you heard them, and so on. And written between the lines is, I'm trusting you, I'm calling on you, I hear nothing. Now, for Jesus to be the victim that would pay the price for our sins, he had to feel the chasm between sinful humanity and the all-holy God. This is why I've come back to this, because otherwise you won't appreciate what Matthew is presuming you know. And this is the powerful position of the victim who has taken all the sins of humanity upon himself. And now he feels this terrible chasm between himself and God. And the challenge for the victim is to bridge the chasm between himself and God. And that's what's going on in Jesus on Calvary, that he is bridging this chasm until he becomes the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge that connects earth and heaven. You remember he said to Nicodemus about the stairway to heaven, he said, you'll see greater things than that. Jesus, when he's on the cross, is the victim that's hanging over the abyss. And we, the redeemed ones, walk across his shoulders into heaven. And he's the one facing the abyss for us. He faces the darkness, he faces the terror of the abyss for us. And so in this wonderful poem that David wrote, you have the victim looking back at himself, look what has happened to me. And then he looks out at the crowds and tells you how he feels about the crowds that are actually looking at him. It's very important. And looking, he says, here I am, I'm more a worm than a man. I'm the scorn of mankind, I'm the jest of the people. All who see me jeer at me. They tossed their heads and they sneered. He relied on God. Let God save him. You're going to hear this from the cross. If the Lord is his friend, let the Lord rescue him. But you see, you need to know that what is written there has been Jesus' experience all the time. It was only the poor and the blind and the lame and the marginalized and the sick and the people in desperate need who actually turned to him. The people in high places just simply despised him. He had the wrong address. He had the wrong companions. He was reaching out to the wrong people. You aren't going to have any success like that. You should have joined us. You should have joined the temple. You should have got yourself a big name. You should have got yourself a big estate. You should have got yourself loads of money. You should have got yourself a title and all the rest of it and put an army together and be a decent Messiah. Instead of that, he was the despised and rejected one. They couldn't see what they were looking at. But it's necessary that you and I do see. Thank you for listening. Slán agus Beannacht Dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
The work of Shalom is an essential part and a powerful part of the work of evangelization, of promoting the objective of sharing the good news of the gospel, the joy of the good news of the gospel and its promise of salvation in this life and beyond death in the new life of the risen Lord. Its evangelization of culture and civilization is a most important objective for the people of God and the church right around the world. In this 21st century, when the human family is battered by so many forces of change, of uncertainty, forces which seem to threaten and menace hope, the hope of the risen Christ and of the good news of the gospel is something which has to be shared not only between individuals, but with communities of peoples right around the nations of God's earth. May the Lord bestow his blessing on the work of Shalom, on all who are associated with it, and also indeed on all those who through their charity and kindness support its most important work.